In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the pivot spring on a DeWALT DW708 miter saw. The pivot spring is the spring on the saw that allows the head to retract back after you make a cut. Over time, that spring will wear out and break and will need to be replaced. And we're going to show you how to do that. To get started, I'll go ahead and remove the blade. Next, I'll remove the depth adjustment knob from the saw. Now I'll lower the head of the saw down and lock it in place. And this will give me access to the guard linkage screw. I'll remove it next. While I have the head of the saw locked in the downward position, I'll go ahead and loosen these two screws. These screws secure the pivot pin. Now I'll go ahead and raise the head of the saw back up to remove the spring. Once I remove the spring, the head of the saw is going to want to fall back down. So a trick I like to use is to take a piece of rope and tie the motor off to one of the rails. This will keep the head from falling once the spring is removed. Now I'll go ahead and hammer the pivot pin out of the saw. I'll do that using a punch and a hammer. I'm not going to remove the pin completely, just enough so that the spring comes free of the saw. That way, the head of the saw will remain attached to the base of the saw. Now we can go ahead and install the new spring. I'll start by placing the bushings back into the spring. The flanges go into the center of the spring so they're touching. Now I'll install the spring assembly into the saw housings. On the head of the saw, there's a pocket in the housing that this part of the spring needs to fit into. From the side of the saw, you can see how the spring is aligned to the pivot pin. You'll need to push the spring up into the housings until the center of the spring is aligned with the pivot pin. Once it is, use a hammer to slowly tap the pivot pin back into the saw. About halfway through, you'll need to stop and align that second flange inside the spring. Now use a flashlight and look in the hole on the other side of the saw. I'm going to use the punch to align the bushing and hold it in place. Once it's aligned, I'll continue to tap the pin through the saw. I'll use my punch one more time to tap the pivot pin in just a little more so that it's centered side to side in the housings. Alright, with the spring reinstalled, now I can go ahead and untie the motor, and I'll lower the head back down and lock it in place. Now I'll go ahead and tighten down the two screws that secure the pivot shaft and reinstall the guard linkage bolt. Now I'll screw the depth adjustment knob back onto the saw. And last, I'll reinstall the blade.